Okay, so I believe last week we left off, we had watched and talked about the clip where he is, come on, go back, there we go, where he nearly gets caught by the FBI agent. And then we actually watched but didn't have a chance to talk about when he makes the call to the FBI agent. Is that correct? Do you remember that? Or am I misremembering things? Jerry's shaking his head, but I don't trust him.
Missed the call.
Oh, so we didn't do the one about the call.
I didn't do the call.
So did we just briefly watch the one about where he almost got caught?
Yeah.
Okay, that's why I couldn't figure I didn't seem to have enough videos, so I was trying to figure that out. So we're gonna watch that clip again and then we're gonna talk about it a little bit. So let's go back here and see if I can get it to play. No, not yet. All right, let's try this again. There we go.
Catch 3 checks, they all clear. I was gonna deposit this one today.
Yeah, we've seen this one.
I don't want any trouble.
Blues Brothers guys come in.
With their black suits.
Right now. Just take this check and be on my way. Thank you.
Good. Because I don't want my customers harassed.
What are you saying? Are you still here?
201.
Thank you.
Corner here.
Thanks.
Steps.
Hey, Mr. Murphy, how are you?
Is that Frank?
Yeah, that's right.
Hey, Frank, how are you?
How's the knee?
Come on, I'll reach you right now.
Take care.
Okay, Frank.
FBI.
See, now you all see it.
FBI! Come on to the bathroom! Step out of the bathroom! Hands on your head.
Well, it's the new IBM Selectric.
Put your hands on your head.
Print type in 5 seconds.
Shut up!
Pop out the ball.
Put your hands on your head! Put your hands!
You know, he's got over 200 checks here.
Hands
Indian
on your head!
drafting. He even has little payroll envelopes
Put
he
it
has
down.
to himself.
Put it down! Drop it!
Relax. You're late, all right? My name's Alan, Barry Allen, United States Secret Service. Your boy just tried to jump out the window. My partner has him in custody.
I don't know what you're talking about.
You think the FBI are the only ones on this guy? I mean, come on. Come on, he's dabbling in government checks here. Been following up a paper trail on this guy for months now. Hey, you mind taking that gun out of my face? Please, really. It makes me nervous.
This is some credentials.
Yeah, I'm sure. Take my whole wallet.
This is the good part.
You want my gun too? Come over here, take my gun. Hey, look, just do me a favor. Take a look outside. Look out the window. My partner's walking into the car as we speak. Look. Old guy almost pissed in his pants when I came through the door. He jumped right through the window onto the hood of my car. Hey, Murph, yeah, call the LAPD again. I don't want people walking through my crime scene.
I didn't expect the Secret Service on this.
Don't worry about it. Well, what's your name?
Henry. Carl Henry.
If I see some identification. You never can be too careful these days. Well, tough luck, Carl. 5 minutes earlier, you would have landed yourself a pretty good collar.
It's all right. 10 seconds later, you'd have been shot. Mind if I come downstairs with you? I gotta take a look at this guy.
Sure thing. Just do me a favor and sit tight for a second while I get this evidence downstairs. I don't want some maid walking through here and making a mess. LAPD should be here any sec.
Wait. Wallet.
You hang on to it for a minute. I trust you.
That makes the whole thing.
Okay, so we watched this last week, of course. So this isn't the first time you guys have seen this, and some of you have seen it before anyway. But okay, so we talked a little bit last week about one of the mistakes that Carl makes in the decisions that he made going into this scene. What's the big mistake that he makes at the very beginning of this? Going up by himself, leaving his backup behind because he wants to be the one who actually catches the guy. And, you know, that's all well and good, but in this case, it costs him his opportunity to catch him because without having backup, he doesn't have the ability to simultaneously process what's going on in the room and the wallet and everything else. And so that's a problem. Now, what does that have to do with us as Christians? Oh, wait, you forgot we were talking about that, right? We're just watching a movie and having, what does this have to do with us as Christians, this idea of Carl, who's the good guy? And that is the thing we kind of have to get our heads around here. You know, up until this point, there's a term, a long time ago, Hollywood stopped calling the people in the movies heroes. They call them protagonists now, because that way they don't have to be particularly heroic. And so the protagonist of this movie, most of the movie, or half the movie, is Leonardo DiCaprio's character. But in reality, the good guy, the protagonist of the movie who's actually the good guy, is Carl Hanratty. So he's actually the good guy. And the first time I saw this movie, I didn't really necessarily see it that way initially, but after working for the county attorney's office, it kind of changes your perspective. And it's hard not to think of it, you know, to look at a lot of what the stuff that the Frank Abagnale character is doing and not see how destructive that is. So the protagonist in this case has people that he has with him. What does that have to do with us? How is that similar to us? When we think about ourselves being the protagonists or the good guys in the sense of trying to do what God wants, how are we similar to that? Do we not have a family? Do we not have people that we can rely on and to help us out? Yeah, we do. Do we oftentimes ignore that and try to do things ourselves that we probably ought to have help with? Yeah. You know, and in particular, the thing that strikes me with this is how often when we know we face a temptation, we don't want to get anybody else involved because we don't want to have to admit to them that we have this thing that we struggle with. And so instead of getting somebody to help us out to deal with something that's challenging to us, we try to do it ourselves, and oftentimes it goes very badly. And so I think that's kind of an interesting concept that we see coming out of this is he goes in there wanting to do it himself and ends up getting nothing for his trouble, rather than actually bringing with him some people who could have helped him to do it. And so when we talk about our approach, and now that we're starting to, because up until now we've pretty much always been looking at the con man, and a lot of our discussion and a lot of our attention has been paid to how we can avoid being fooled by people who are like that. And absolutely is a valid thing, and we're going to keep talking about it. But ultimately, hopefully at least, what we see in this movie that we relate to more closely is the Carl Hanratty character, who's trying to do the right thing, who's trying to prevent people from being harmed, and who's trying to root out this person who is the criminal, who is doing these criminal things. And so it's important for us to recognize in that then, what are his failures, what are his weaknesses, what does he do right and what does he do wrong? And the right thing is, obviously, he has backup. You don't send, law enforcement generally doesn't send people to a known threat without backup. Now, sometimes if you're just out patrolling, and Mark could certainly speak to this, you kind of have to deal with stuff on your own initially. But if you know it's a problem, you don't just, they've all got guns in their car. I guess I'll go up and see how it's going myself. That's not really, it's not really the best approach, In this case, he doesn't know what he doesn't know. And that's the real thing, is we oftentimes don't know what we don't know. So we don't know what the threat is. We don't know what we're really facing. And until we do, it's much better to have somebody with us, or several somebodies with us, who can help us to be prepared for that threat, and just go hope we can do it by ourselves. And so I think that's a really important principle for us as Christians, that we are not doing this on our own. And we don't have to be afraid of our backup, betraying. Well, I mean, sometimes we do, it's the reality, but the point of the church is that we have people we can rely on, and that we can be confident we can tell them things to them and stuff like that, and that they'll have our backs. And that's a big part of what the church exists for, is to encourage and build up our fellow Christians. So, okay, so that was the point that I started making last week, and I wanted to finish today. But then what else do we see in here? What else jumps out at you as you're watching this? Besides the fact that his credentials were backwards when he showed them to the maid.
Well, DiCaprio is able to disarm the situation with confidence, arrogance, if you will, a perception that he's not the guy you're looking for. He's a fellow. He yarns a story, and it's like, so the guy was convinced that he had him, and he was talked out of it.
Yeah.
Well,
So-
that says he's not a very good agent if he didn't look at the credentials whenever they were handed to him. That's what struck me, because,
Yeah.
yeah.
DiCaprio
He was too
kept
prideful.
He kept distracting him.
distracting him. Look out the window, look out the window. This is,
But it's not just distraction, it's the confidence. Whenever you say things with confidence,
Right.
people don't disagree with you.
Yeah.
And so that happens in our Christian walk too. Somebody can come in here and say it with confidence. Unless we know, and we're studying the scriptures, we can be led astray
Yeah.
just as easily.
So there's a bunch of things that you guys just said that I want to kind of unpack for a second here. And I know you raised your hand, and actually, what were you going to say? Let's throw this in there.
I was going to say, watching it again, he did have about a minute to come up with a story. And this guy is super fast on his feet.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's thinking, okay, what is this guy, what can I do to make this guy trust me? I'll walk out, like Sarah was saying, with confidence and say, I'm the Secret Service, we've been chasing the same guy. That's his story, which is believable.
Yeah.
I mean, so he is right on the cusp of telling the truth, but he knows he can use that against us. And just like other supposed Christians do, they do read maybe one scripture out of the Bible, but they won't give the context or whatever. And so a lot of people think, oh, this guy knows what he's talking about, just like the show does. And you lose it that way. And
Yeah.
people are trusting until it's too late.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, so all of this, so let's start, I want to start with something Sarah said, though, because I think this is an important point. So you said he's not a very good agent. And what's interesting is that up until this point, the only context that we've seen Carl Hanratty in is in the context of processing information and figuring out patterns and figuring out that something is wrong. And in that regard, he's a very good agent. He's very, very good at the procedural, not the procedural, sorry, at the, what's the word I'm looking for here? The
Analytical.
It's not even exactly administrative. It's kind of like paperwork investigations. So, and the FBI absolutely has some people like that. So does the Secret Service. They never go in the field. Their job, the CIA has people like they're analysts, and what they do is they look at whether it's photographs or video or signals intelligence or paperwork or whatever, and they figure out what's going on from that. And so those kinds of people don't necessarily translate well into the field, necessarily. It's the same way with lawyers. There are a lot of lawyers who very rarely, if ever, actually go into a courthouse. If they do, it's to file something. It's not to actually appear in front of a judge or something like that, because not every lawyer has the temperament to get up and do arguments in front of a jury, or or whatever else it is. They don't think on they're attorneys who don't think on their feet very fast. Some of them don't do very well just in general, but one of the things when you go into court is you have to be able to think on your feet. You have to be able to deal with a lot of things happening at once. You have to be distracted and still function and stuff. And some attorneys just don't do that, especially as they get older. It gets harder and harder. I find that myself as I get older. It gets harder and harder to process all this stuff. So the reality is that not every agent is designed to be a field agent. And in Hanratty's case, I think it's absolutely true. This is maybe not the very first time he's been out in the field, but it's probably one of the first times. And certainly we get, and I cut this part of the scene out because there was quite a bit of bad language in it, but we get the clear picture that it's the first time he's been in the lead investigator, where somebody else isn't the one organizing what they're doing. And so he makes mistakes that he probably wouldn't make if he had more experience or if he'd been more trained in that particular area. Now, as the movie goes along, he's going to get better at it. And that's an important point to understand, is we don't always start off good at the things we do. Sometimes we have to learn and get better. Unfortunately, in his case, he has a fairly big, mistake at the very beginning of his process here. So, Ian.
It seemed also like DiCaprio was using his pride against him a little bit.
Yes.
Where he said, "What, you thought you guys were the only one on this case?" And then you could see Tom Hanks' character, his face kind of dropped, like, what did I miss?
Yeah.
Because he's got that perfectionist attitude, and DiCaprio just kind of ruined that for him.
Yeah.
And really threw him off.
Right.
The
Here.
pride angle was what I was getting at when I said he wasn't a good agent. He let his pride get in his way.
Yes.
And that can happen to us as Christians so quickly, so easily. Where
Yeah.
humbleness is definitely a quality.
And I think, and here again, I think that's one of those things where he made assumptions, and his pride was a factor in that as well. And so rather than doing the smart thing and taking his backup with him and approaching it from that standpoint and continue to question everything as he saw it, he was much more inclined to accept what he saw. And that was a learning lesson for him. And like I said, as the movie progresses, he's not going to make the same mistake again. And the reality is, we all, as you said, we all make mistakes. We all have pride that gets in the way sometimes. We all make mistakes in the things that we do. No matter how well trained we are, no matter how much we know, we still make mistakes. And the trick isn't so much to never make a mistake. I mean, we want to try to avoid them as much as possible, and if possible, learn from other people's mistakes. It's always better to learn from somebody else's mistake than your own mistake. But the trick is to not make the same mistakes over and over and over again. Learn from them and do better the next time. Steve?
So the agent wanted to get the credit, and a friend of mine here locally quoted Ronald Reagan, but I don't remember the quote. He just said it came from him. And it goes something like, if you're willing not to take the credit for something, you can get a lot done.
Yeah, that's probably, I can imagine Reagan saying that. That's absolutely true. And that's part of it. And when it comes to the pride thing and comes to us as Christians, that is a principle that we definitely see echoed in the scriptures a lot, where Jesus is talking about, you want to be, the goal is to be the servant. The goal is to be the least and then be exalted by God, not to elevate yourself, because then you're going to get knocked down. And so when we are focused excessively on credit, on being the one who gets the praise or whatever, it can be problematic. And I am aware of the fact that being the guy who's up in front talking all the time is kind of a privilege as well as an obligation. It's kind of fun because I do get a lot of the credit. I mean, it's just inevitable, unless I'm really bad at it, and then I don't. But when I'm talking, people are seeing me, and our song leaders, people are seeing them. And so the people who come up and do the Lord's Supper, so the ones who are doing these presentations, and even though in our congregation there's a lot of us that actually do those things, it's still a lot less than half of us that are coming up and doing those things regularly, and yet we do tend to get most of the attention. And that is an unfortunate reality of the way that the human mind works, but the truth is that having been in church my entire life and been in some very large churches, some very small churches, I am keenly aware of the fact that the only reason I get up here to talk is because a lot of other people have laid a foundation to make that possible. And a lot of other people are doing the things behind the scenes and sometimes in front of the scenes where they're just not noticed, that if we didn't have those things done, we would not be functional, And so it's important for us to recognize, on the one hand, that we're not always going to get the credit we deserve. On the other hand, it's also important for us to recognize those who do those things and make sure we're giving them credit. You know, and I really appreciated, I think it was Sue last week that mentioned Jerry's role in kind of making everything happen, you know. Most churches have, especially smaller churches, have one or two people like that. They're in the background, and they're the ones that are kind of, you know, they don't necessarily do everything, but if somebody doesn't show up, they're the ones that end up fixing the problem. You know, if something breaks, they're the ones that end up fixing that problem. So we want to try to be mindful of that so that people don't feel like they're being ignored when they do important work for us. But we also want to recognize that humility is the goal, and if we have humility, we are able to get a lot more done, especially since we're supposed to work together on stuff like that. So, okay, so the learning curve is an element of it, the humility is an element of it, and then the other thing that I think several of you hit on is the confidence aspect of it. And that's why they call them confidence men, is both because they have to operate with confidence and because they generate a false confidence in their victims that they believe whatever the story is that they're telling. And so I think it's a really critical point that Mark makes, that he doesn't, that even whatever happened, whether DiCaprio had gone into the bathroom initially or whether he was, you know, near the bathroom and that was when, you know, the guy shouts FBI and he jumps in there, one way or the other, he gives himself a little bit of time to think. Okay, and that's a critical thing, is that to realize is that a lot of times as Christians, when we're dealing with bad people, we have to be reactive, not proactive, and that's not always the ideal place to be. What's the difference between proactive and reactive?
And proactiveness, you're thinking about it ahead of time and preparing. When you're reactive, it's in front of you, you have to react right now.
Okay. And that's a great definition, Terry, or Tim, sorry.
Just don't call her Tim.
Please
Okay.
That's not a mistake on me. I have known, actually, really close friends of my family, a guy, his name is Terry McMorrin. His wife's name is, it's a very feminine name, so it helps from that standpoint. It's, you know, you kind of, but anyway, so it's a really good point though, Tim, because, or a really good definition, because the key is, when you're proactive, you're the one doing things, and the other side has to react or figure out how to respond to what you're doing. Now that doesn't mean that you have to react in a vacuum. So, I mean, firefighters, by definition, for the most part, are reactive, right? I mean, you don't go start a fire and then put it out, except when you're training, hopefully, anyway. So, you know, so you have to go to what the situation is. But that doesn't mean that you show up like, well, look, there's a fire here. I guess we should have talked about this beforehand. You know, you have a plan, you have the equipment, you know what you're doing. It's just that you don't necessarily get to control the situation. Proactive, in being in a position of proactiveness, generally allows you to kind of control the situation and the direction it's going to go in, up to a point anyway. And so even just this little bit of time, coupled with Frank Abagnale's particular genius, is enough for him to be able to become proactive in the situation. And so initially, at least, you would think the guy with the gun kicking the door into the room is the guy who's proactive. He's in charge of the situation, he has control of the situation. And so Frank realizes he has got to switch the tables on that. And so he does that by presenting something that's unexpected and doing it with confidence. And so for us as Christians, we need to understand that even though we are proactive in the sense that we're going out into the world and we're spreading the gospel, that when somebody comes in and tries to teach something false, a lot of times we're kind of in a reactive mode, initially at least, because we have to figure out what's wrong with what they're saying, and we have to figure out how we're going to deal with what they're doing. And sometimes, a lot of times, that's more a matter of reacting than it is creating. Steve?
It's a little like offense and defense.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, you just kind of said something that I was thinking of, that in the church, we can take a stance of just ignoring situations and not reacting at all, not being proactive at all, and until it gets to be pretty critical. And we need to be proactive in defense of Scripture, what's being taught, and the spiritual health of the church community.
Yeah.
Before it degrades to a point where you can't recover from it.
Right. And to go to that analogy of the firefighter thing, even though you can't always know what the next problem's going to be, proactive preparation is about doing things to prepare for possibilities and preparing for, getting yourself to the maximum best place you can be, so that if something does go wrong or somebody does try to create a problem, you are as well prepared for that, or as well defensed for that as you can be, even taking into account that you can't know everything. So you don't, and you think about it, we're taking about offense and defense. I'm going to shift my metaphor a little bit here, but you think about football. And you think about, you watch it, and on the football field, the offense is generally the one that's doing things, and the defense is generally the one that's trying to stop them. But there are times where a good defense flips the script on that. And I can still remember going and watching the 1997 Fiesta Bowl. University of Arizona was playing that against Miami. Miami was like what, top 8th or 10th ranked team in the country, and the U of A wasn't even ranked. But the U of A had this monster defense that just had not quite gelled throughout the season, but they came together in that game. And the Miami offense never crossed the 40-yard line on their side of the field. And more than half of the time, their quarterback was just running for his life from the defense. It was a fun game to watch if you were a U of A fan, not so much if you were a Miami fan. But so being on defense doesn't mean being passive, and that's a really important thing. And it definitely doesn't mean just kind of going, well, I can't do anything about that, and just being unprepared for it either.
What Steve was talking about with the church, an example that has always stuck in my brain, years and years and years ago, before, it's had to have been, it has to have been about 30 years ago maybe, we were looking for another preacher up here. And Steve and I had gone down to the valley, and we were visiting at a congregation, and they knew we were looking for a preacher. And Steve mentioned this one man's name, and one of the elders said, "Don't move." And he ran to his office, and he came back with this file. And he said, "You don't want this guy." He said he was here trying out, and he was up at this pulpit, and he was saying things that were wrong. And he said, as an elder, I could not let my sheep hear that. And he stood up, he stopped the man, he got him down from the pulpit, and they escorted him out of the building.
Wow.
They said, "We will not have you teaching false doctrine." Now, to me, that was one strong elder, because once he stepped up, the other elders agreed. They all stood up, and they got the man out of the situation and protected their flock.
Yeah.
Then he didn't stop there. He protected the flock up here by letting us know. So, and Steve looked through some of the documents that he had, and we saw it, and we realized, this is not who we want. So, you have to be on the defense on stuff like that. But I think that will always, and that elder's gone now, and I just really appreciated that man. He was just so strong to protect. And some people might look at that as disruptive. But he said, I had to protect my sheep. That's my job.
Yeah.
And I guess that just will always stay with me as a strength.
Yeah. It's not easy to be
No.
the one, for most people. My instinct is to argue with people, so it's actually pretty easy for me. But it's not easy for most people to do that, and to be that proactive, to literally go up and say, okay, you have to get down now. We really struggle with something like that in general. And I can remember when I was still worshiping and preaching part-time for Desert Sands down in the valley, we had this guy, we asked him to teach, because he'd actually done he had quite a bit of success with evangelism. We asked him to teach several lessons on his evangelistic method. And it turned into, and I guess because he uses this as the way of scaring people into becoming Christians, but it turned into this discussion of his belief about how the afterlife is structured. And he has this, how do I say this? A lot of right ideas that when he puts them together in the wrong way become a very wrong idea, I guess is the best way I can say it. And I think all of us have probably encountered that at some point or another, where everything kind of makes sense, and then somebody manages to put it together in a way, and you're like, well, that's not how that goes together. That's you've made it. And what his particular thing was is he went through and looked at a lot of different descriptions or mentions of the afterlife in the scriptures, and in particular, and essentially he approached all of them as though every one of them was absolutely literal. None of them were parables. None of them were Jesus using analogies. None of them were, the kind of the larger than life speaking that we sometimes see in the Bible, where they're trying to portray an idea. And certainly none of it is, even though we're explaining something you can't really understand, we're going to use some words that are the best we can come to that. So he took everything out of there and made it literal. And when you go through, and the particular problem is when you go through Revelation, I believe, tells the same story twice. It goes through and talks, and the conflict on earth and on earth and in heaven, and leads to the judgment, and then it restates it, I think, using different imagery, basically, and you have the judgment again. Well, for him, there are two judgments in Revelation, so what does that mean there must be in real life? Two judgments, So he goes through, but ultimately where it gets him, or part of the problem where it gets him, is because of his theology and because of the importance that he places in making sure that people understand that the choices you make in this life are the last choices that you get to make, and after that comes the judgment, which is totally right. Because of how literally he wants to make that, he ends up getting himself to a place where once you're dead, there's absolutely no way that you can come back, that anyone can come back. And that's a problem. Because who do we know that came back from the dead?
Jesus, obviously.
Kind of important, right? So in his, and it's not just him. There are people that Jesus raised from the dead. There are people in the Old Testament that are raised from the dead. And so the problem becomes, if you say that nobody can come back under any circumstances, you've locked yourself into a place that's very problematic, because then what must have happened? Well, his explanation was, what must have happened was that those people didn't really come back from the dead. They were just ghosts or physical, they were manifestations, basically. Well, the problem with that, of course, is that runs directly into the teachings of John and Paul and Peter, all of them, and it really leads you into a type of teaching that we've all talked about in here. Anybody know what that is? A false teaching, I should say, that we've talked about in here. It's one of the tenets of Gnosticism, that Jesus was not physically, that either he was not physically here at all, or that at some point in his existence he ceased to be physical and became incorporeal, so that he was not affected by the sinfulness of the physical nature. And so this guy, without ever meaning to, and I have no reason to think that this guy was trying to mislead people. I think that he was trying very hard to come up with a way to articulate how important it was to become a Christian. But by reasoning and wondering his way into it, he had managed to stumble into neo-Gnosticism. Now, I didn't actually say that, but in the class that he was teaching, ironically, I've been up here for the previous 2 weeks, and my mom had been telling me about what he was teaching, and I'm saying, this isn't right, and so I'm down there that week, and that's when he went all the way around the bend. And I couldn't really sit there at that point, because we don't have elders at Desert Sands. Me and Don Booth are the only guys who really are the ones who are likely to stand up and say something, and so I felt like I had to say something, and so I began to disagree with him. He misunderstood what I was saying, and I could have said it better in retrospect, but he misunderstood that I was saying that I didn't think that judgment was a permanent kind of a thing, that we just kind of, that it wasn't that big of a deal. And that wasn't my point at all, and I think later on other people in the congregation told me that they had understood what I meant, but he was leading the church off track. And not in a way that was necessary. That was the irony, is that what he believed was, like I said, I think it's absolutely true, but I don't think you have to go the direction he did to make the arguments he did. And so there are times where we become conscious of the fact that somebody is misleading us, or at least may be misleading us, or may be portraying something that's wrong. And we do have an obligation to step up and say, first of all, let's clarify what you're saying, and second of all, if that's what you're really saying, then this is a problem. And here's why it's a problem. And so we have to be, that's reactive, but it's also proactive in the sense of taking the initiative. And that's when we think about offense and defense in football, initiative is really, it doesn't matter whether you're the offense or the defense, initiative is who's doing what to somebody else, basically. And if you're on the initiative, you're the one doing things. If you're on the defense, you're the one who's reacting to that. So we don't always have to be stuck on the defense just because somebody else started the problem or started the issue.
We had a very similar individual who had a history of disrupting congregations come and start wanting to assemble with us. And we said, that's fine, you can assemble. He was there a little while, and he wanted to teach the high school class. And so we discussed it, the elders discussed it, and he was a pretty good Bible student, so we said, okay. But we had an elder in the class every time he taught. I mean, we sat in and it lasted about 2 months, and he came to the elders and said he was going to leave because no other class has an elder sitting in it.
Yeah, well.
So that was being proactive.
Yeah.
Without saying anything.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so I got a bunch of hands, so let's go back to the back with Terry, and then we'll come over here to Ian.
Well, Jared just brought up another point that Karen had brought up. If that man had a little bit more humility in him, he wouldn't have reacted that way. He could have learned instead of walked away from the situation, which is really sad when we walk away. The other one is you brought up a couple things is proactive and reactive. Whichever one is your favorite, you need to be prepared.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that's all there is. There's two of them I want to mention. 2 Peter 3:17. Therefore, dear friends, since you already know this, be on your guard so that you may not be carried away by the error of lawless men and fall from your secure position. And the other one is in Colossians 1. I have it circled. The little word if is really important. If you continue in your faith established and firm, not moved from the hope held out in the gospel. So we're not guaranteed unless we're continuing to move in the direction of Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. That's fantastic. Ian.
To piggyback off of Terry, I went to Ephesians 6 where we talk about the full armor of God. And that is kind of a really good guidance there on how to be proactive and reactive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A lot of it is defensive, but some of it is offensive, or at least is proactive in that sense. We don't like to use the word offensive, that sounds bad, but Mark.
I was gonna say, a lot of the world today too, they've heard, they've seen movies and they've seen things about heaven, and they want to start there and they want to talk about Revelation.
Right.
They want to go there right away. And it is hard to be ready for that and be proactive about saying, well, let's figure out how do we get there first. Let's start at step one and let's go there, and then we can work up there. But so many people they make that mistake of trying to go right in there, and then,
it gets weird.
Yeah, and then the people we've lost them because now we're trying to say things that we just don't know.
Yeah.
And there's some things that's going to happen and going to do, but we just don't know.
Right.
And so it's sometimes it's just say, I just don't know. But let's get back to this. This is the most important thing. How do we get there? Then we can worry about that when it happens. So I think we sometimes get ahead of ourselves a little bit, and we think we know it. But sometimes we get that thrown at us, and then we're not ready for it.
Yeah.
And then we're stuck. We're like, uh-oh. And finally, you just have to say, I just don't know. Let me go and look and study.
Right.
We'll talk about this later, but first I want to go here, because I want you to be, I want you to become a Christian.
Yeah.
And then you get to go
Then we
to
can talk about that stuff, yeah.
That's the hardest thing,
Right.
too, because people want to hear about all the neat things about heaven, but they don't want to hear about how do I get there.
Yeah, that's true.
They want to be there.
Or they want to talk about the weird stuff.
Yeah, all the crazy things.
Yeah. Yep. Steve.
So this Frank guy, he eventually got caught, and he paid for his
See, I was gonna wait to show that until later.
So, I mean, he's a real guy, he really did get caught, but he was able to fool a lot of people, and we see that history really does repeat itself, and it's because people never really change. And we have the same vulnerabilities, and someone with a bit of an aptitude toward that and a willingness to cheat and hurt people can take advantage of the weaknesses of people who perceive most everyone as being good and moral and ethical, and that they're going to tell you the truth, they're not going to cheat you, and especially when they come to you like they're so nice.
Right.
And
I'm going to come back to that. That's a really good point.
Yes.
And actually, that was one of the things I wanted to mention this, because one of the things that you noticed, or maybe you didn't notice it, but you saw it, is before Carl gets into the room. We see Frank Abagnale walking up the stairs, and he goes past the blind guy and the guy that's helping him. And how does he behave towards them? Yeah, he's super nice. You know, he's friendly. He's clearly, he knows the guy. He clearly has developed a relationship with him. So he speaks to him. And of course, he's able to use that later on as part of his disguise, more by luck than anything else. But still, he's able to do that. And one of the really important things to realize is that the people who are a danger in terms of infiltration, a danger in terms of false teaching, they are usually people who look good in most other respects. They are people who are super friendly and super nice and thoughtful and those kinds of things. They are people who are successful and who are well-spoken. You don't often, the dangerous villain is rarely the Hitler type. I mean, that happens in selective kinds of situations, but they're rarely so obviously evil that you look at them and go, well, that dude's a lunatic and he's gonna ruin the country. You know, you don't see that usually with those kind of things. We don't have the Wicked Witch of the West with, you know, a pointy nose and a black cap and green skin, and you go, well, that's the bad guy. You know, it's not that hard. You don't get Darth Vader. Whatever. I can use a lot of different examples of this. The point is, the people who are dangerous to us, from what Jesus says, don't worry about the guy that can kill you. Worry about the guy that can throw you to hell. Worry about God and the judgment that God brings with it. So the people that we as Christians need to be the most worried about are not the people who are obviously the bad guys. Bad guys are going to do bad things and they're going to make bad things happen, and that's a reality, but that's a physical reality. Very few people see Darth Vader going along and go, well, let's do whatever he tells us to. That seems like that'll be a good idea, you know? And so when we think about the kinds of people that we have to worry about, the ones we have to worry about are the ones who look and sound nice and you know, friendly, and they're, you know, and it doesn't mean we should be paranoid that every person who sounds nice and friendly is a bad person, because that's obviously how we want to sound. But the point is, these are people who blend in. And that's a big part of why Frank Abagnale is so successful, because in whatever role he assumes, he blends in. He has things that he's prepared, like a wallet full of what feels like credentials, which is really just stuff he tore off the front of bottles and stuff like that. He has contingencies prepared to be able to blend into the situations that he finds himself in. And you know, he does his research, so he knows the reason he knows the vulnerabilities of the airlines and the vulnerabilities of the banks is because he researched that stuff. He doesn't just, you know, completely wing it unless he absolutely has to. And so the kind of people that we have to be worried about are those kind of people. And that's why it's valuable, like it or not, for churches to have a few members who are a little bit maybe cynical and a little bit experienced. And in fact, one of the things we see when Paul talks about elders and talks to the elders is, you guys got to be wise. You guys, not like worldly, he doesn't say be worldly, but be wise. Recognize the threats and the dangers, because your congregation, that's the reason we talk about them as sheep, they may not see the dangers. They may not recognize the threats, but there need to be people who are wise enough to ask questions and look deeper and not necessarily kind of make the assumptions that most of us are inclined to do. And it's always useful to have at least one or two of those guys in any given church, because they kind of, we had a guy like that down at Desert Sands. He was a former, he had been, and he doesn't mind me telling this, he had been a drug addict, he had been an alcoholic, he had been a panhandler, and he got his life turned around. He'd been raised in the church, fallen away obviously, and then kind of recognized where he'd fallen from and kind of came back again. And he was the best guy in the world to have, sniffing out people who came around looking for money who really weren't, you know, legitimate. He knew the right questions to ask, he could see right through it. He was a great guy to have around for that kind of stuff, because he could do that. Now, you don't want to put him in charge of the benevolence ministry, maybe, because he can be a little bit, you know, everybody's the bad guy in his world. So you got to kind of temper that. But it's good to have some people like that who do have that ability to recognize when something is not right. Jerry?
We had the confidence of that person doing that. We had a lady in the congregation that answered the phone, and it was a con man, and ended up costing her about $2,500 before she got off the phone with the guy. The next time we questioned things, and we made some different appearances, different phone calls, found her son instead of Mexico in jail, he was in Washington.
Right.
Answering the phone.
Yeah, a little bit of a different thing. So,
They put you on hold.
yeah, so there's a lot of that stuff, and I think as we start to look more in these clips at the good guy and his job, and we need to think more and more in terms of what he does right and what he does wrong. You know, and he picks up on the pattern. We saw that last week. He picks up on the pattern of what's happening. He's the first one to recognize that there's a problem, but even he is still vulnerable to someone who's clever enough and who is confident enough to be able to lead him astray. And so we need to recognize that just because we can sometimes see a problem doesn't mean we can always pick up on what it is and that we can always respond to it the right way, at least the first time. So we're going to take a break. We got to thank you guys for your participation. This has been a really good class, and we'll pick up with worship in 12 or 15 minutes.